Her betrayal didn't break me. It introduced me to the man I'd been hiding from my whole life. I sat in my office, the blue light of the monitors casting a sterile glow across the walls. The room was my haven, everything in its place, a fortress of order. The desk held only my laptop, a notepad, and a single pen, perfectly aligned with the edge. Lines of code scrolled across the screen, a language I spoke fluently, one that never demanded more than I was willing to give. It was past midnight, and the house was silent, just the way I preferred it. Control. Predictability. These were my anchors. The door creaked open, and Caroline stepped in, her bare feet whispering against the hardwood floor. She carried a mug of tea, steam curling upward in delicate tendrils. Her hair fell loose over her shoulders, and she wore one of those flowing dresses she loved, soft greens and blues that made her look like she'd stepped out of a dream. "Still working?" she asked, her voice gentle but edged with something I couldn't name. "Just finishing up," I said, keeping my eyes on the screen. I was troubleshooting a client's firewall, tracing vulnerabilities in their system. It was solitary work, and I liked it that way. She set the mug beside me and lingered, her presence a quiet disruption to my focus. "I went to that poetry reading tonight," she said. "It was inspiring." "That's nice," I replied, glancing at her briefly. Her eyes met mine, searching, waiting for something more. I didn't know what she wanted. Poetry was her world, not mine. It always felt too messy, too unstructured. "Yeah," she murmured, turning away. "Good night, Elias." "Good night," I said, watching her slip out. The room felt emptier without her, a chill settling in that I couldn't explain. I pushed it aside and returned to my code. Caroline and I had been married for 8 years. We met at a friend's art gallery opening, a memory that still felt vivid. She was standing in front of a painting, her head tilted, lost in the colors. I walked over, and we talked about how the artist used light to stir emotion. She spoke with such fire that I was pulled in, even though I didn't fully grasp it. Back then, my steady nature balanced her chaos. She called me her rock, and I liked being that for her. But somewhere along the way, that steadiness turned into a wall she couldn't climb. Lately, she'd been different, distant, her usual spark dimmed. She spent more time out of the house, going to wellness circles or meeting friends. I didn't mind, my work kept me busy, and I trusted her. As a cybersecurity consultant, I spent my days shielding systems from chaos, finding comfort in the logic of it all. Maybe that's why I didn't notice the shift at first. One night, over dinner, she tried to draw me out. We were eating steak and roasted potatoes, the kind of meal I liked, simple, straightforward. She set her fork down and leaned forward. "I watched this documentary today about the planet. It's terrifying, Elias. Everything's falling apart, and we're just sitting here." I chewed thoughtfully. "There are steps being taken. Solar energy's growing, and policies are shifting. It's not enough," she cut in, her voice sharp. "We need to feel it, to do something now, not just wait." "Feeling it won't fix anything," I said, keeping my tone even. "We need plans, not reactions." She stared at me, her eyes narrowing. "Sometimes I wonder if you feel anything at all," she said, so quiet I almost missed it. Her fork clattered onto her plate, and we finished the meal without another word. That stuck with me, though I didn't let it show. Did she really think that? I'd always been this way, calm, measured. Growing up, my parents were engineers, obsessed with reason. "Emotions muddy things," my father used to say. So I learned to keep mine locked down, to be the one who didn't falter. It worked for me, built a career I was proud of. But with Caroline, it seemed to push her away. A few nights later, I was working late again when her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She was in the shower, and I glanced at it out of habit. A notification glowed on the screen from someone named Silhouette. "I dreamt you left him last night. You kissed me at the train station." My pulse quickened. Who was this? What did it mean? I stared at the words, trying to make sense of them. Was it a joke? A mistake? The idea of Caroline with someone else felt impossible. We had our struggles, but this? I didn't touch the phone. I just watched it until the screen went dark, my mind spinning. When she came downstairs, wrapped in a towel, she grabbed it without a glance my way and disappeared into the bedroom. I stayed in my office, the silence heavier than before. After that, I started noticing things. She was cagey with her phone, taking calls in the other room, smiling at messages she didn't share. She left poems around, scribbled lines on scraps of paper, full of longing and heat. They weren't in her handwriting, and she'd stopped asking me to read her work. Once, she'd thrust her notebook at me, eager for my thoughts, even if I only offered practical notes. Now, she'd say, "You don't feel it anyway," and pull away. One evening, I found a poem on our shared desk, half hidden under a stack of bills. "Your touch is the only truth I know. In the silence between breaths, we grow." The words hit me like a jolt. They were raw, alive, nothing like the careful life I'd built. Whose were they? Why were they here? I put it back, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe it was from a friend, or she was copying something for inspiration. But a nagging doubt took root, sharp and unfamiliar. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I just watched, waiting for the pieces to fit. A few days later, she announced she was heading out. "It's a meditation group," she said, avoiding my gaze as she grabbed her bag. "I'll be back late." I nodded, standing in the doorway as she left. The house settled into stillness, and I sat in the living room, the quiet pressing against me. For the first time, I felt a pang I couldn't name, loneliness, maybe, or regret. Was our marriage slipping? Was I the reason? I didn't have answers, but something was shifting. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever came next would change everything. Her laptop sat on the kitchen table, its screen blank, a silent witness to whatever she'd been pouring her energy into earlier that day. She'd been typing with an intensity one hadn't seen in months, her fingers dancing across the keys as if chasing something vital. I stood there, staring at it, my conscience wrestling with the urge to look closer. Privacy had always been sacred between us, an unspoken pact from happier days, but the weight of doubt pressed harder now, urging my hand forward. I brushed the trackpad, and the screen blinked awake, asking for a password I knew by heart back when trust was a given, when we shared everything without hesitation. I typed it in, the desktop blooming into view, a chaotic spread of folders and files that seemed to pulse with secrets. One folder caught my eye, tucked among the clutter, inspirations. It was unfamiliar, a newcomer in the digital landscape I thought I knew. My pulse quickened as I clicked it open, revealing a collection of documents with titles that sounded like whispers from another world, moonlit whispers, echoes of us. I opened the first one, and lines of poetry spilled across the screen, words woven with a tender ache that stole my breath. "Your eyes hold the universe, a galaxy of secrets we share. In the quiet moments, I find my truth, wrapped in the warmth of your stare." The language was lush, intimate, but it didn't carry Caroline's voice, her style was softer, more measured. These were raw, unguarded, signed with a simple T or dedicated 4C. My hand shook as I scrolled through more, each poem peeling back a layer of something I wasn't ready to name. I tried to reason it away, to convince myself it was nothing more than an artistic exchange, a collaboration with some poet friend she'd met at one of her groups. Caroline thrived on inspiration, always hungry for new voices to spark her own. But the intimacy in those lines gnawed at me, whispering truths I didn't want to hear. I needed something concrete, something beyond the ambiguity of verse. Closing the folder, I navigated to her email, where her inbox unfolded in neat categories: work, personal, miscellaneous. Then I saw it, a folder labeled Silhouette. My throat tightened as I clicked, revealing a thread of messages stretching back months. The first email was from someone named Theo. "Caroline, your words tonight were like a balm to my soul. I've never met anyone who understands the ache of existence like you do." I scrolled down, my chest constricting with every line. Her reply came next: "Theo, being with you feels like coming home. Elias is a good man, but he doesn't see me the way you do. He doesn't feel the world like we do." Theo's response was swift: "I know, my love. He's trapped in his own cage of logic. But you deserve to be free, to soar with someone who can match your spirit." The words blurred as I read on, their exchanges painting a picture of stolen moments, shared dreams, and plans for a life that didn't include me. I couldn't stop, even as the pain twisted deeper. My training as a cybersecurity consultant kicked in, instincts guiding me to dig beyond what she'd left visible. I accessed her deleted emails, recovering fragments she'd tried to erase and messages about clandestine meetings, the rush of their hidden connection. One stood out, sharp and piercing. I told him I was going to a wellness circle, but really, I was with you, under the stars, feeling alive for the first time in years. The truth crashed over me, undeniable now. Her meditation groups, her late nights, they'd been a cover for Theo, for a bond that had grown in the shadows while I sat here, blind and trusting. I slumped back in the chair, the laptop's glow casting harsh light on a reality I couldn't unsee. Caroline was entwined with this Theo, a poet who fed her soul in ways she believed I couldn't. To her, I was the barrier, the practical man who stifled her spirit. Anger flared, a fierce heat coursing through me. How could she discard everything we'd built for some dreamer spinning pretty words? Yet beneath it, a quiet grief took root. She saw me as cold, unfeeling, never guessing how much I'd muted my own heart to fit the role she seemed to need. I shut the laptop, the click echoing in the stillness, the house now a hollow shell of the life I'd known. Sitting there, enveloped by the dark, I felt the storm of emotions settle into something unexpected, a clarity I hadn't tasted in years. The facade I'd worn so long had cracked, and through it, I glimpsed a piece of myself I'd forgotten. I couldn't unknow this, couldn't rewind to ignorance. The path ahead loomed, inevitable and uncharted, but for the first time in ages, I wasn't numb. Whatever came next, it would be real, raw, and mine to face. The bedroom was a mess of half-packed boxes and tangled sheets as I waited for Caroline to walk through the door, my hands gripping the edge of the mattress until my knuckles turned white. I had spent the last hour staring at her laptop, reading the emails and poems that confirmed everything I had feared about her supposed meditation group, and now the truth sat heavy in my chest, a mix of anger and something sharper I couldn't quite name. Years of holding myself together for her sake, keeping my emotions locked away because that's what she said she needed, unraveled in the silence of this room we'd shared for so long. I heard the front door open downstairs, her bag dropping with a dull thud, and her footsteps climbing the stairs, each one pulling the air tighter around me. When she stepped into the doorway, still in her coat, her hair mussed from the wind, she froze, her eyes catching mine and narrowing slightly, like she could already sense the shift in the atmosphere. "You're still awake," she said, her voice careful, testing me, and she shifted her weight to one hip, arms crossing as if to shield herself from whatever was coming. I stayed where I was, not moving, just watching her, letting the moment stretch until it felt unbearable. "How was your meditation group tonight?" I asked, curling my fingers into air quotes around the words, letting her hear the edge in my tone, the disbelief I wasn't bothering to hide anymore. Her face tightened, lips pressing into a thin line before she answered, "It was fine, Elias, why are you saying it like that?" She took a step forward, dropping her arms, but I could see the way her shoulders stiffened, bracing for impact. "Because I know it wasn't a meditation group," I said, standing up slowly, my voice low and even as I closed the distance between us. "I know about Theo, Caroline, so don't pretend with me." Her breath caught, and for a second, she looked like she might argue, but then her expression crumpled, and she turned her head away, running a hand through her hair like she could push the truth back out of sight. "How did you find out?" she asked, barely above a whisper, and I shook my head, feeling the anger flare hotter in my chest. "Does it even matter how I found out? I read the emails, saw the poems, every word you wrote to him, every piece of yourself you gave away while I was right here." She wheeled back around, her eyes flashing with something between guilt and defiance, and her voice rose to meet mine. "It's not what you think it is, Elias, it's not some big conspiracy against you." I cut her off, stepping closer, my hands clenched at my sides. "Don't tell me what it isn't when I've seen what it is, don't stand there and lie to my face after everything I've been through for you." She flinched, but she didn't back down, her chin lifting as she snapped, "Maybe I wouldn't have needed to if you'd actually been here, really here, instead of shutting me out all the time. You've been so distant, so wrapped up in your work, I needed someone who could talk to me, who could feel something with me." Her words hit hard, digging into old wounds I tried to ignore, but I wasn't going to let her turn this around on me, not now. "You think I don't feel anything? You think I wanted to be this way, always steady, always holding it together because that's what you said you needed from me? I've spent years trying to be enough for you, Caroline, and you never even noticed." She shook her head, her voice cracking as she shot back, "But you never let me in, Elias, you never showed me anything real, anything I could hold on to. Theo listens to me, he gets the parts of me you didn't even try to understand." I stared at her, the air between us thick with years of things we'd never said, and I could feel the ground shifting under me, the realization that we'd both been running from the same emptiness. "And you didn't try to understand me either," I said, my voice quieter now, cutting through the noise of her accusations. "You wanted someone loud, someone who'd spill everything out for you, but I'm not that person, I never was, and you didn't care enough to see who I could have been." Her eyes filled with tears, and she swiped at them angrily, her voice trembling as she replied, "Maybe I did want more, maybe I needed more than what you gave me, someone who could meet me halfway instead of just standing there waiting for me to figure it all out." The room seemed to close in around us, every word pulling us further apart, and I could see it so clearly now, how we'd both been chasing shadows of what we thought the other should be. "So you went to him," I said, the bitterness slipping into my tone despite my efforts to keep it steady. "You found someone else because I wasn't enough, because I couldn't be what you wanted." She looked away, her hands twisting together, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, almost pleading. "It wasn't supposed to turn out like this, I didn't want to hurt you, Elias, I got lost." I let out a sharp laugh, the sound rough in my throat, and shook my head at how small that excuse felt after everything. "But you did hurt me, and now you're standing here expecting me to fix it, to fight for something you've already walked away from." She looked up at me, her face softening, and for a moment, I thought she might reach out, but she just whispered, "I don't know what I expect, maybe it's too late for us anyway." The words settled between us, heavy and undeniable, and I took a deep breath, feeling a strange calm wash over me, a decision I hadn't realized I'd already made. "If Theo's what you need, then go to him," I said, my voice firm, final. "But don't act like I didn't try, don't pretend I didn't give up pieces of myself to make this work." Her eyes widened, surprise flickering there, and she stammered, "You're not going to fight for us at all?" I shook my head, stepping back, putting space between us for the first time that night. "No, because the man you want isn't me, and the man I am, you never bothered to know." She stood there, silent, tears streaming down her face, and I could see her searching for something to say, some way to bridge the gap, but there was nothing left to hold on to. "Pack your stuff," I said, turning toward the door, my voice steady even as my chest ached. "You can stay tonight, but tomorrow, you need to leave." She nodded, a small, broken sound escaping her as she moved to the closet, pulling clothes off hangers with shaking hands. I didn't watch her for long, just turned and walked out, the weight of her choice and mine settling into my bones, a painful kind of release I hadn't known I'd been waiting for. The house felt cavernous without Caroline, her absence seeping into every corner like a persistent draft I couldn't locate or fix, and though I buried myself in work, letting lines of code and security protocols consume my days, the quiet always found a way to claw its way back, sinking its teeth into me when I least expected it. I'd sit at my desk late into the night, the laptop's blue glow washing over me, and try to focus on something, anything, but her departure had left a jagged edge in my mind, one that snagged on memories I'd rather leave untouched, reminding me of how much I'd bent myself to fit her expectations over the years, how much I'd swallowed to keep the peace. But now, with the lies exposed and her gone, something restless stirred inside me, a flicker of defiance that refused to be ignored, pushing me to do more than just endure her betrayal. I wanted her to feel its weight too, to know she couldn't walk away without consequence. One night, staring at the folder on my desktop labeled Caroline's Stuff, I opened it and found her poems again, the ones she'd written for Theo, her secret muse, words she'd never meant for me to see, and as I read them, each line dripping with a passion she'd never shown me, I felt a strange jolt, not just anger but something sharper, something that demanded action. I'd always been the practical one, the guy who solved problems with logic and precision, but those poems, her hidden truths, lit a fuse I didn't know I had, and before I could second guess it, I opened a new document and started typing, pulling her verses apart and stitching them into something new, a story that twisted her words just enough to blur their source but kept their sting alive. It wasn't about dragging her name through the mud or spilling her secrets to the world, it was about taking what she'd withheld from me and making it mine, proving I could wield the same raw energy she'd always claimed as her own, showing her the depth she'd ignored in me all along. Over the next few weeks, the story grew into something I barely recognized, a quiet rebellion against the void she'd left behind, following a woman who chased fleeting thrills only to stumble when she realized the steady presence she'd dismissed had been a reservoir of untapped strength she'd never bothered to notice. I threw everything into it, the ache that kept me up at night, the fury that simmered under my skin, the regret that gnawed at me for not speaking up sooner, and when it was finished, I sent it off to a literary journal under a fake name, not telling a soul, not needing anyone's approval, just wanting it out there, a piece of me set loose to breathe on its own. When the acceptance email came a month later, saying they'd publish it and that readers were already passing it around online, calling it haunting and profound, I felt a quiet thrill settle in my chest, knowing Caroline would eventually stumble across it too, and when she did, she'd have no choice but to face the echo of what she'd done. She reached out not long after, her message popping up on my phone one evening, short, cautious, asking if we could talk, and I let it sit unanswered, imagining her rereading the story, wondering how much of it was her, how much of it was me finally breaking free from the shell she'd helped me build around myself. Then, one night, I ran into her at a bookstore I'd started haunting to fill the empty hours, flipping through a collection of Neruda's poems when I sensed her before I saw her, that familiar pull tugging at me even now. "Elias," she said, her voice softer than I remembered, and I turned to see her standing there, looking worn, her usual fire dulled by something heavy I couldn't quite place. "I read your story," she went on, her eyes locking onto mine, searching for a crack in my calm. "It was beautiful. Painful, but beautiful." I gave her a slow nod, keeping my thoughts locked down, and she stepped closer, her hands fidgeting the way they always did when she was rattled. "I know it was about us," she said, her voice dropping low. "About what I did, what I didn't see." I let her words hang there, the silence stretching out between us, giving her space to feel their weight, and after a moment, I said, "It was about a lot of things, Caroline. But yeah, you were part of it." Her throat bobbed as she swallowed, tears brimming in her eyes, and I could see her gearing up to say more, maybe to apologize, maybe to reach for something we'd lost, but all she managed was, "I'm sorry, Elias. For everything." I held her gaze, taking in the lines of regret etched into her face, the way it had hollowed her out, and I waited for the rush of victory I'd thought I'd feel, but it didn't come. Instead, there was just a calm clarity, a recognition that we'd both been architects of our own collapse. "I know you are," I told her, my tone even, and then I turned back to the bookshelf, signaling the end of it, letting her linger for a heartbeat before she walked away, leaving me with the faint trace of her perfume and the poems in my hand. Standing there in the stillness of the bookstore, I realized the revenge I'd chased wasn't about wounding her, it was about clawing my way out of the wreckage, about finding a voice for the parts of me I'd silenced too long, and that story, born from her betrayal, had been my way of shedding the skin I'd worn to survive our marriage. Caroline had lit the match, sure, but I'd used the flames to forge something new, something real, and as I paid for the Neruda book and stepped out into the night, I knew I didn't need her to feel whole anymore. She'd handed me the tools to rebuild, even if she'd never meant to, and now the rest was up to me. I had settled into the coastal town, a place smaller than I had pictured when I decided to move here, with the ocean always close enough to hear its steady rhythm through the open windows of my rented cottage, and it suited me perfectly because it offered a stillness I hadn't known I was searching for until I arrived. My routine had taken shape over the weeks, dividing my time between managing my digital security firm, which I kept running through long hours online, and sitting down each evening to write, letting thoughts flow onto the page in a way that felt raw and necessary, a habit that had grown out of the story I'd published months earlier, its unexpected success still lingering in my mind as proof I could create something lasting. The distance from my old life had given me space to breathe, to think without the constant press of familiar streets and faces, but even so, Caroline stayed with me, her presence a quiet thread woven into my days, not loud or demanding, just there, tugging at the edges of my attention when I least expected it. That night, I was on the porch, the air cooling as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in colors I didn't bother naming, when my phone jolted me out of my thoughts, buzzing against the wooden table where I'd left it, and I saw her name glowing on the screen, sharp and sudden, pulling me back to a place I tried to leave behind. I sat there, staring at it, my fingers resting on the edge of the table, debating whether to let it ring out or to face whatever she had to say, and after a few seconds, I picked it up, swiping to answer, her voice breaking through before I could even speak. "Elias, it's me. I wasn't sure if you'd pick up." I shifted in my chair, the wood groaning slightly under me, and said, "I wasn't sure I would either." "Why are you calling, Caroline?" She hesitated, her breath audible through the line, and then she said, "I've been going over everything in my head, about us, about what happened, and I just needed to talk to you, to see if we could figure it out somehow." Her words landed heavily, stirring something inside me, a mix of old pain and something softer I couldn't quite place, and I leaned back, resting my head against the chair, letting the evening air settle around me as I responded, "Figure it out? You mean figure out why you left, why you picked him over talking to me about what was wrong? She made a sound, a sigh that carried years of weight, and I could almost see her wherever she was, maybe in the kitchen we used to share, her hands fidgeting with something, anything, to keep them busy. It wasn't that clear-cut, Elias. I was confused, drifting, and I didn't know how to reach you anymore. But I've had time now, and I see how much I messed up, how much I didn't appreciate what we had. I listened, waiting for the rush of frustration to take over, to push me into saying all the things I'd held back, but it didn't come, and instead, I felt a strange steadiness, a clarity I hadn't had before. You did mess up, I said, keeping my voice level, measured, and so did I, because we both let things slide, pretended everything was fine when it wasn't, and that's on us, not just you. She went quiet, and then she asked, her tone careful, do you think there's a chance we could try again? Start fresh, leave all that behind us? The question caught me off guard, stirring the calm I'd built, and I looked out at the horizon, the last light fading, trying to find an answer that felt true. Try again? I said, more to myself than to her, and then I shook my head, knowing she couldn't see it. I don't think we can, Caroline. Too much has happened, and we're different now, both of us. Acting like we could wipe it all away wouldn't work. Her breath hitched, and when she spoke again, her voice trembled, I miss you, Elias. I miss us, even with all the flaws. My throat tightened, but I pushed past it, needing to say what I'd carried for too long. I miss pieces of it too, I said, but we can't undo what's done. You needed something else, and I needed to figure out who I am outside of us, and that's where we are now. The silence stretched between us, heavy and full, and then she whispered, so this is the end, then? For good? I nodded to myself, feeling the truth of it settle in, a quiet ache mixed with relief. Yeah, it's the end. But I'm not angry anymore, Caroline. I want you to be okay, even if it's not with me. She sniffed, her words breaking apart as she said, thank you, Elias. I'm sorry I couldn't make it work. I managed a small smile, one she'd never see, and said, you don't need to keep apologizing. Just look after yourself. Then I hung up, setting the phone down, leaning forward with my hands clasped, letting the conversation sink into me. The night closed in, the air crisp against my skin, and as I sat there, I realized the bitterness I'd held onto had loosened its grip, leaving behind something lighter, a sense of being done, not just with her but with the person I'd been. The marriage was gone, and with it, the version of me who'd tried to hold it together, but standing in its place was something new, something I could build on, and when I got up and walked back inside, I felt ready to keep going, to see what came next without looking back. The coastal town had woven itself into my existence over the past year, its presence steady and undeniable, the kind of place that doesn't demand your attention but earns it through persistence, through the way the air carries salt and the horizon stretches out like an unspoken promise. I'd carved out a life here, split between the digital security firm that somehow flourished despite my relocation clients didn't care where I was as long as their systems stayed locked tight, and the evenings I spent writing, letting thoughts unravel onto the page in a way that felt less like a hobby and more like a necessity, each sentence peeling back layers I hadn't known were there. The story I'd slipped into the world under a pseudonym had gained traction, whispers of it circling among people who didn't know my name, and while I stayed in the shadows, the act of putting words out there had become a tether, a way to wrestle with the past without letting it choke me. The marriage, the betrayal, the day I walked away, they lingered like echoes, not gone but quieter now, their sharpness dulled by the months I'd spent rebuilding, figuring out who I was when no one else was watching. I was in the cafe one afternoon, the one with the uneven wooden floor and the smell of yeast drifting from the back, sitting at a table by the window with the coffee going cold, when the door swung open and Caroline stepped inside, her gaze sweeping the room before settling on me, her expression shifting from uncertainty to something softer, like she'd been holding her breath and hadn't realized it until that moment. She looked different, hair cropped close to her jaw, shoulders looser than I remembered, and as she walked over, I felt no surge of bitterness, no tightening in my chest, just a mild curiosity about why she'd come, what she wanted after all this time. Elias, she said, her voice even but carrying a faint warmth, I wasn't sure you'd still be here, but I took a chance, thought maybe we could sit for a bit, if you're up for it. I nodded toward the chair across from me, and she sat, her hands settling on the table, fingers brushing the corner of a napkin like she needed something to do with them. How'd you track me down? I asked, keeping my tone light, genuinely puzzled, and she shrugged, a small smile tugging at her mouth. Word gets around, and I figured you'd end up somewhere like this, off the grid but not too far gone. We sat there for a moment, the murmur of the cafe wrapping around us, the clink of cups and the low hum of conversation filling the silence, and then she leaned forward slightly, her eyes steady on mine, and said, "I read your latest piece, the one about the lighthouse keeper, and it hit me hard, Elias, how much you've got in you that I never saw." I tilted my head, a flicker of pride mixing with surprise, and replied, "Took me a while to see it myself, to let it out instead of keeping it locked up." She looked down at the table, her fingers stilling, and when she spoke again, her voice dropped lower, "You've changed, haven't you? This place, the writing, it's done something good for you, something I couldn't." I leaned back, letting her words sink in, and said, "Yeah, I changed, had to, but it's not just this town or the writing, it's figuring out I don't need to be who I was, that I can stand on my own without all the old holding me down." Her gaze lifted, locking with mine, and I saw a trace of the history we'd shared there, the weight of it, but it didn't drag me back like it once would have. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she said, her tone careful, like she was testing the ground, "about where we went off the rails, and I get it now. I was so wrapped up in my own head, chasing what I thought I deserved, that I didn't see you, not really, not until it was too late." I listened, her confession settling between us, and then I said, "We both up, Caroline. I kept myself shut off because I thought that's what you needed, and you went looking for something else because I wasn't there the way you wanted, but we can't rewrite it, can we?" She swallowed hard, her throat bobbing, and after a pause, she asked, "Do you ever wonder if we could start over, now that we're not the same people, now that we've both had time to figure out?" The question landed heavy, but the answer was already there, clear as daylight, and I shook my head, keeping my voice soft. "No, I don't. I learned too much from us to go back, and what I've got now, it's mine, built from scratch, not tied to what we were." Her eyes shimmered, but she didn't push, just nodded slowly and said, "I get it, I do. I just needed to see you, to know you're not still hurting." I reached out, my hand resting near hers, close but not crossing that line, and said, "I'm good, Caroline, better than I've been in a long time, and I want you to find that too, whatever it looks like for you." She gave a faint, bittersweet smile, pushing back from the table, and as she stood, she hesitated, glancing back at me. "Keep writing, Elias, it's who you are now," she said, and then she was gone, the door easing shut behind her, leaving me with the hum of the cafe and a strange, settled feeling, like I'd just turned the last page of something I'd been carrying too long. I stayed there a while, watching the street through the window, the world moving on outside, and later, walking the beach as the light faded, I thought about how breaking apart had forced me to face myself, how the mess of losing her had stripped away the parts I'd clung to out of habit, leaving something raw but solid in their place. The life I'd made here wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and that was enough to keep going, to see what came next with my eyes wide open.